Greetings and welcome to the Putnam History Museum's in-depth conversation with Peter Bunten of the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery Project. My name is Cassie Ward and I'm the Executive Director of the Putnam History Museum. Also on this call, we welcome Christine Furch, who is the Vice President of the Putnam History Museum. We are thrilled to welcome Peter, the chair of the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery Project and the former Education Director of Historic Hudson Valley. Today, we'll be talking in depth with Peter about slavery and anti-slavery in the Hudson Valley, about historical sources and current interpretations, as well as past and present projects related to Black history in the Valley. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much.
So I'm very thrilled to be part of this. I started discovering Peter's work 3-4 months ago, and so I'm very delighted to follow up on the interview that I saw with Hudson Highlands Land Trust. So we're very much grateful for them for introducing you to us. And there I found your organization, the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery Project, History Project. So maybe you could just begin by giving us a little recap of what that project is, how it got going, and what things are happening now.
Sure, I'd be happy to. First of all, thanks so much for having me. This is a great pleasure, a great honor to be here. And it's particularly exciting because, and I think we'll get into this a little bit more later, about what it appears to a lot of us in the history community has been kind of an explosion of interest in this history, and that's really important. The Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery History Project began around 2006 when a group of local historians, educators, and others who were interested in this history decided to gather a lot of research that had already been done, a lot of articles on the history of Dutchess County, and then expand on that and take a look at, more broadly, the history of slavery and anti-slavery in Dutchess County. In the 1700s up until, just before the Civil War period. One of the initial spurs to this was that in 2006, there was the replica ship of the Amistad. And the Amistad was essentially a slave ship. And it went back to the 1830s, by which time the international slave trade had been abolished. However, there were pirates still around. And so a number of the enslaved people on that ship mutinied. And the ship was eventually brought into New England. And they were eventually freed. First of all, they were accused of kidnapping, but it was actually, of course, the traders who were kidnapping them. Anyway, there was a replica of the Amistad that was going up and down the Hudson River. So this group of folks in Dutchess County said, I think it's time for us to commemorate this. And then out of this, we will develop that history. So in 2010, we published our Dutchess County Guide for some of the history and the sites of slavery and anti-slavery in the county. A couple of years after that, we published a group of 36 anti-slavery songs. And we can spend a little bit of time on that because that's just a fabulous thing in and of itself. And since then, we've been doing a little bit of work on expanding that history. And also we've developed teacher training materials. We've given a lot of lectures and other types of presentations. So that takes us up to 2000 and, oh my God, it's 21. 2020.
Right.
Yep.
Let me just dig in a little bit more, because this, I think, is an interest for our group, is developing the personnel and kind of drawing people in from the community. Between 2006 and when you published your publication, the first one you mentioned, how did you gather the people to do that work? How did you find the resources? Tell us about how that could be.
Yeah, a number of these folks were brought together through either the First Congregational Church in Poughkeepsie or the Presbyterian Church or the AME Zion Church. So they had some church connection, at least a lot of them did. So they knew each other and they had already some interest. The AME Zion Church was originally an anti-slavery church. First Congregational has a fascinating history about how it got started, also connected directly to the anti-slavery movement. One of the people involved, a couple of them, but one of the main ones involved was also a Vassar professor, Rebecca Edwards. And being a professor, she had a lot of graduate students who were looking for stuff to do. So a lot of those grad students were put to work doing some of the real deep researching in city and county directories, looking up at deeds and wills and stuff like that. While a number of the other folks were reading and doing some exploring on the broader concepts, spaces within the county that had some history. For instance, taking a look at the whole Quaker movement in the eastern part of the county. So it was a fairly broad-based group, as I said, of historians, those who were already interested, some church folks, etc. And they figured out, okay, let's dig into this. And then they said, well, we're working toward all of this research and whatever, so we need to put this into a written form that will be usable.
Interesting. So that was the first Vassar connection right there then, because I see a lot of connections with them.
Right, that was the first well, there,
Okay.
you know, probably there were some Vassar folks before, but there's been a strong tie-in of Vassar. And interestingly enough, Matthew Vassar, who was the founder of Vassar College, was tied into some of the local history because in 1865, after Abraham Lincoln was killed, his funeral train stopped in Poughkeepsie. And Matthew Vassar took some of the branches of the magnolia tree, one of which is still down at the site, and brought it to the Lincoln funeral train. So there, Vassar has a tie in there as well.
Wow, wow.
Yeah.
All politics is local. Very interesting.
And you know what?
Comes right back.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because we'll probably get to it again later. But one of the things that everybody who's worked in this project has supported and really drove for is making the connections between our local history and national history. And there were so many examples, even real big examples where Dutchess County folks led other events that were going on nationally, instigated some of this stuff.
Peter, so you formerly were with historic Hudson Valley, and then now you're with the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery Project. So can you walk us through your career a little bit and how, you know, you got to where you are today and what you do exactly at the project?
Sure. I've always loved history, and I read a lot of the popular history books in college and then afterwards. But until 2006, 2007, I never really began to concentrate so much on it. I had some graduate school when I was living in New York City, but then left that because we moved to Maryland, was working in an entirely different field, then picked up and I got my master's degree in history with a concentration in public history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Then we moved back up to New York City, and I decided that I was not going to do any work that was not related to what my real interest was at that time. And I'm a Dutchess County native, even though I live in the Bronx. So I kept scanning around and I found Marist College in Poughkeepsie, which is where I graduated from. And they were hosting at that time the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery website that has since transferred over to Vassar. And I said, well, who is this? So I wrote to them, and in 2011, I attended my first meeting and I fell in love with it. So this is what I have been doing, not just with the history project, but in a lot of other related activities. So
how about with historic Hudson Valley? Because that was another great resource for us. We've been studying their work.
Well, that was the best job I ever had.
Okay.
Working at HHV, because well, just because the people there are so incredibly fabulous and they're so in love with history And I had a great opportunity because I was working at Philipsburgh Manor. And that's the site where I say we, even though I'm not there any longer, but that's the site where we interpret the history of slavery in the North. This is another key thing. I don't know how many people who are going to see this realize that there was so much slavery here in New York colony and then in the state. We had the largest concentration of enslaved people north of Maryland. And New York State was the next to the last state to finally get rid of slaves, and not until 1827.
Can you talk a bit about the different roles and positions that enslaved people held or were forced to hold here in the North or in New York State?
Yep. And I'm glad you mentioned that. This is another example of some misunderstanding or some mythology about slavery. Even in the South, where on, let's say, the on the cotton plantations and on some of the indigo plantations in Louisiana, et cetera, the vast amount of work was devoted to those crops. However, enslaved people performed a lot of other things. And we'll go back to Philipsburgh Manor for the moment. The number one person listed on that inventory is an enslaved person by the name of Caesar. Caesar was the miller. So we think about, what does it require a miller to do? You have to be able to read. You have to have management information. You have to be able to count and measure to make sure you're not getting, rooked by the boat that's coming down the river, et cetera. So it requires a lot of skill and it requires a lot of learning. A number of slaves were actually boat pilots, and they piloted on the Hudson River and they came back. So you've got to know sailing. You've got to be able to take care and rebuild a sail or a spit. You've got to be able to navigate. So those are those skills. A number of the enslaved people, and if you take a look, are you familiar with In Defiance? It's a book of runaway slave ads by Susan Stetson Cohen and Ashley Hurlbut Biagini. Take a look at that, because in the back, I think it's in the back of the book. They have some stuff in the middle, but in the back of the book, there's a whole list of the types of jobs that are mentioned in the runaway slave ads. So you've got blacksmiths, you've got millers, you've got cordwainers, which are shoemakers. You've got people who worked in the domestic side. So there's a variety of jobs. And in the North, where you had such a variety of living conditions, as I say, not like just a plantation worker, you were apt to do a lot of different things. You had to be able to take care of horses and other animals. You might have been a coach person driving back and forth, so you needed to know directions. You probably needed to know how to read, etc. So that area of understanding slave life in the past couple of decades has just exploded, because we read more and more of these actual documents. You see the different types of jobs they had to learn. They were some skilled learning. A master miller, such as at Philipsburgh Manor, might take 8 to 9 years to become a master miller. You had to learn how to cut the stones, redress them, fix any problems with the mill itself. So it's a variety of different jobs. People think of slavery and we think of, go back to your high school and even college textbooks, and it's all about cotton. It's all about the northern economy versus the southern economy. But slavery played a big role up here, and in New York State, it played almost an outstanding role. But working at Philipsburgh Manor really opened up my eyes to really getting into the details of what it was like. I don't know if you realize this, but Frederick Philipse, who had that manor house built and the old Dutch church across the street, he never lived there. He lived down in Lower Manhattan, which is where his business interests were.
Mm.
Now, when HHV was first interpreting that manor house, they were interpreting it as the house of a rich lord.
Mm.
And it wasn't until the late 1990s when, before I got there, but when they started to redo the research and developed a new program, because the enslaved group of 23 Africans, or African Americans, most of them by that point, they were the only permanent residents
Mm.
around the manor.
Mm.
And I'm going to jump ahead because one of your questions is going to be how you can do research about Putnam County.
Mm.
It wasn't just those 23 enslaved people at the manor house, but a lot of the tenant farmers coming all the way up into what is now Putnam County. A lot of those tenant farmers also owned slaves.
Mm.
So we'll talk about it, I'm sure, later, but one of the things that you can do is to get a hold of the records that are in HHV, and they may even have them already in digitized form that they could copy for you.
Mm.
Take a look at the family names of the tenant farmers and take a look at their records and see if there were any enslaved people there.
Very interesting.
Yeah, so it was just a great learning experience.
Mm.
You learn a lot about teaching, about themes, and we developed a whole number of different programs.
Mm.
Just
if we could mention, there is a wonderful online presentation through Historic Hudson Valley, People
yes,
Not Property. It's another
yes,
thing that I really learned from when I was preparing for this. And it's been going on for a long time, and they've really been trying to not just talk about interpreting through the lens of African American history, but they really did it. And I think it's an
yes.
impressive outpouring.
They really did it, and it's a lot of people reference that website because first of all, it really highlights the enslaved people who were living there.
Yeah.
It's also the vehicle for helping to understand more broadly slavery in the North. And there's also great references at the end of that online program
Yeah.
too,
No,
for
it's
further research.
incredibly instructive. Yeah.
It
Can I
is.
ask one more follow-up,
Of course.
Executive Cassie? And then I'll go. Oh, thank you so much. Just one second. So it does, just starting with where you're at, that as I read over the publication or the research paper through Vassar, that I think was one of the original ones that you all put together. And it does seem like the research really goes through by the names of individuals, by families, trying to find individuals,
Right.
and then building some story from there.
Yes.
Can you speak more about that in terms of how
Sure.
that goes?
This ties into one of the challenges of this kind of history is that a lot of it is lost. A lot of people didn't publicize the fact that they owned slaves. And certainly if you were involved in the Underground Railroad, it was even rarer because if you helped a runaway slave or a freedom seeker, you were breaking the law. And after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, you were breaking federal law. So a lot of people might have been deterred by that. And those that weren't were being very careful because you didn't want to advertise around because you might not know who would find out. Or you might not know that there was an agent from some southern plantation who was in the neighborhood and say, hey, I just heard this, maybe I'll go check this out, etc. So you had to be careful. But there are a number of people who did talk about it. There are some letters. There are some folks in Dutchess County, either through churches or through anti-slavery activities. We take a look at a number of the Quakers over on the eastern side of the county, and particularly those involved in the 9 Partners meeting up around Millbrook. So we know, sometimes I have to put little air quotes around that. We know that they were involved in, we sometimes don't know what that involvement detailed, but there are letters and there are some writings about how they felt about slavery and how they supported the anti-slavery movement. And this might be a good time to distinguish between uh, anti-slavery and abolitionism.
Hmm.
There is a difference. Abolitionism fits under the bigger umbrella of anti-slavery feeling and the anti-slavery movement. But a lot of people were opposed to abolitionism. In other words, immediate freedom, no strings attached. They have to be freed right now.
Hmm.
A lot of people were not supportive of that. A lot of white people and even some African Americans. So abolitionism was a branch underneath that big tree. You know, we can talk more about that if we want to. So there's a lot of aspects to this. So when you talk about anti-slavery, that's a broader activity. If you talk about the Underground Railroad, that's a part of it. If you talk about abolitionism, that's a part of it. So there's pieces that you kind of put together to get the whole picture of what this was like.
So you could potentially believe in anti-slavery, but not be an abolitionist.
Absolutely. And in fact, a lot of people, I would say the great majority of Northern white people were anti-slavery people, but not abolitionists. Not abolitionists.
Mm-hmm. So what did they believe then? They thought that they should be not enslaved, but they should still be indentured, or what was the anti-slavery approach that?
Well, wow, that's a great question.
Mm.
Let me jump in on the issue of race here, because, and I'm going to just say something about the Civil War. Why did people in the North fight in the war? The great majority of those people fought because they supported the Union, not because they were necessarily wanted to get rid of slaves. I think motivation changed over the course of the 4 years of the war for a lot of the soldiers who were fighting. But if you read newspapers and stories and books about why people fought, essentially it was all men, why men fought in the war, the great majority of those fought because they wanted to save the Union. They did not like what the Confederacy was doing. They thought it was illegal. You know, they thought even their livelihoods were at risk because there were business interests going both north and south. And looking at it from our perspective, it seems clear that the fundamental issues separating the two sides had to do with slavery. But it's not true to say that everybody in the North fought the war because, well, I shouldn't say that because the word because. They didn't fight the war because they wanted the slaves to be free. They fought the war because they wanted to keep the Union together.
Mm-hmm.
And as a couple of years went by, some of them changed. Remember, there was a big furor within the political world in Washington when Lincoln proposed the Emancipation Proclamation. You know, they thought it was unnecessary. Some of them thought it was unconstitutional. Lincoln got around that because he said, well, it's a war measure, et cetera, et cetera. So, and we have to look at what happened after the war was over. Well, there was a few years of Reconstruction where some rights and privileges were given to African Americans, and then 1877, the North turned its back. And then there was another, well, it's continuing today, I would argue, suppression of Black rights. So even those who were ardent abolitionists were not necessarily fans of an integrated social society with Black people. Even, you know, a lot of the American Anti-Slavery Society, a number of the other societies that sprung up before the Civil War in support of freedom for the slaves, when those organizations ended, you know, nothing about Black rights, Black voting, and New York had a horrible record on allowing voting for freed Black men. They turned it down 3 times in the middle of the 19th century. Always attached to that was a $250 or more $250 or more worth of wealth. $250 is a lot of money. So they made it very difficult for freed Black people to fit in with the rest of the society. The Quakers from their founding in the 1600s were major slave owners. They didn't even blink an eye. They ran huge sugar plantations on Barbados. And when Quakers began to populate North America, primarily in Pennsylvania and a couple of the Midwest areas, and then eventually into New York, slavery was an accepted thing. The first questioning of slavery in regards to, what it means to be a Quaker, to be part of the Friends, came late, late in the 1600s, and it never got anywhere. A couple of folks said this. There was a question that came out of Germantown, from the Germantown, Philadelphia area meeting. Is it right for Quakers? Is this part of who we really are? And then it was the Quakers in Dutchess County who really pushed the envelope. The Quaker meeting up in Quaker Hill near Pauling, I was actually there yesterday, they sent what's called a query. They sent a query of about 7 or 8 questions down to the quarterly Quaker meeting in Westchester County. And they asked those questions, can we be true Quakers if we own slaves? How can we, how are we supposed to treat the enslaved people? How can we say that, which was their core element of their belief, was that each Quaker has to find and follow his or her own inner light. But how can someone who's being kept in slavery follow his or her own inner light? Especially, it says, my inner light tells me I should not be a slave. So they got their hands slapped for raising this issue. The quarterly meeting in Purchase didn't want to handle it. They sent it down to the annual New York meeting, and they punted for 2 more years. So it wasn't until 1770 when the New York finally answered it, and they gave some kind of wishy-washy saying, gee, you're kind of stirring the pot here, But 9 partners up in Millbrook and the Oblong at Pauling, they proceeded on their own before they even got an answer, and said to all of the members of those 2 respective meetings, slavery is not appropriate and you need to get rid of your slave people. I mean, this was a really revolutionary movement.
Wow.
And it was around Philadelphia and right here. Well, you're in Purchase, you're in Putnam, and I'm not even in Dutchess County anyway, but you know what I mean. So Dutchess County Quakers played a leading role in pushing the Quakers toward an anti-slavery position.
Wow, so interesting.
Yes.
So fascinating, because I feel like I've always have heard that Quakers always believed in anti-slavery, so that I didn't realize that there is this previous chapter.
Oh, yes, a big previous chapter. And it wasn't until 1790 when the Quakers in Dutchess County were able to get their members to totally get rid of. So it took a few decades, but they were pushing the envelope, but only after some of the internal Quaker questioning had happened. But before that, Quakers, in a sense, were as big or had no problem with slaveholding the way a lot of other, white owners and plantation folks did. It's a fascinating story, and one that I think a lot of people are not aware of. I grew up saying, Quakers are against war, they were anti-slavery, and that's really all I knew about Quakers. So, but there has been, by the way, in the last, I'd say 10 years, what is this, 2021, 10 years, maybe 15, there has been a plethora of research done on Quaker documents and what their beliefs were, et cetera. And there's just a lot of fascinating, I don't want to call it an expose because the Quakers weren't hiding it, but it's just, there's a richer and deeper understanding of the Quakers vis-a-vis slavery that is now available, in published form, et cetera.
Very interesting.
Have you been able to find any sources or documents from the enslaved perspective?
There are some letters, there are some essays, there are some reports of enslavement that were written after the Civil War. And so there is some raw material directly from the enslaved people, from African Americans themselves. I mean, pick up any autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and you're going to get a lot of stuff.
Mm.
And Sojourner Truth's autobiography, which went through about 4 or 5 different editions. And of course, she's local. Frederick Douglass actually came to Poughkeepsie at least twice to give talks.
Mm.
And then there are sources, and not as many as we would like, but they are there.
Mm.
I wish we had a bunch for this part of New York State, which we don't.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Sojourner Truth is there, but I wish we had some lesser known people.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I admire about your group so much is all the partnership you're engaged with Vassar College. I was doing a little exploration today about what seems to be a collaboration with the Dutchess County Historical Society and this equality trail that I think, if I'm naming it correctly.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit, or your collaboration with them.
We are doing some work with Bill Jeffway is the manager. I don't think that's his right title, but he's the one who heads up the Dutchess County Historical Society. Hmm. And so he and I have, we have a number of, irons in the fire. I don't know how many of them are going to bear fruit because everybody is so busy, but we did decide to, because he looks at some material, he's got a lot of sources and a lot of history that's been written about in their yearbooks. And we've got a lot of stuff which goes into some more depth, et cetera. Mm. So we were collaborating or talking one day and we said, you know what, let's start to think about a trail around the county that people could drive to, or maybe do a bicycle trip and see all of this history. So the first effort there was the Freedom Trail, and we concentrated on a couple of spots in Poughkeepsie. And our hope is that over the succeeding years, we'll be able to shine a spotlight on some other stuff. Mm. And perhaps the Quaker Trail to Freedom, as it's called, that might be a good thing because it's concentrated. A few of the meeting houses are still standing. That you could actually visit. And so our and it goes beyond that. We're looking at when the History Project was developing the guidebook, one of the student staff people at Vassar went into the Poughkeepsie city directories for the mid-1830s and used some other sources as well, and tried to identify every single African-American who was living in the county at that time. So we've got some rich research material that we can probably develop into some other interesting programming or website adaptations like the Freedom Trail, because there's a lot to do on the Freedom Trail.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like, I guess this is one of our biggest questions as a group, and why we were so pleased to have you, is like, what could we do to begin contributing to the conversation more and to the interpreting and the important ways all these other organizations have. It seems like what your group, what Dutchess County Historical Society was able to do, is that they began with some sort of focal points. They had, like you might have had the AME church, or the different churches you mentioned with the history, or Dutchess County has all these, Lincoln came, all these particular moments or focal points.
Right.
And would you recommend that we would begin too, like thinking about what are the Putnam County focal points that add to the story, or how would you help us take next steps?
Well, I think one thing you would do is forget the fact that you were part of Dutchess County until 1812, and just
Okay.
believe that all of those towns were part of who Putnam County is today.
Yeah.
Because Dutchess County didn't want them, or however that happened. And I'm taking a look at a table from Michael Groth's history of slavery in Dutchess County. So we're looking at places like Frederickstown, Franklin, Patterson, Philipstown, and there are quite a few African-American and quite a few slaves in those towns in the starting in 1790 when the first African-American census was taken. So for those towns, and I can send you, I can upload a copy of this and send it to you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
For those towns, they may have town histories that talk about this. And so that would be one place to start, is take a look at some of these towns where we have recorded number of enslaved people and also recorded number of African Americans, at least from 1790. There would be other data you'd have to dig for locally in archives and stuff. But knowing that, that could be a starting point for talking a little more broadly or trying to make some connections. I could easily see you developing something that talks about the early history of Putnam County, who Frederick Philipse was, who his son Adolph was, the whole fact of slavery throughout the entire, well, we would call it a plantation. It was called a manor up here, but, and you don't have to go into Frederick's history unless you want to, because he was a pirate, essentially. He hired pirates to get Africans and bring them up here. The first group of Africans that were taken out of Africa came and the boat landed at Rye, and they marched them over to what is now Tarrytown, you know, to the Pocantico River. And that's where they built the manor house, and they built a mill. And the flour that came out of that mill and another mill down at Yonkers, which is another Philipse manor, helped make him even wealthier than he was, because he was trading for white gold. I mean, that's what sugar was. It was white gold. And so you could start by taking a look at the historical records for those 4 or 5 towns that dropped out of Dutchess County. And that could be the start of something really good. You know, you could develop something, you know, just around the 5 towns of slavery in Putnam County, or you know, and you know, just when you start to pull some data together and you present it, you're going to find a lot of other people are going to come up to you and say, hey, you know what, did you know this, or whatever, and that kind of thing. So so when I was driving home from the oblong meeting yesterday, the first town I came to when it crossed the border is Patterson. I said, I know Patterson. Now I know Patterson because I've been looking at it for the Quaker kind of stuff. So that's one thing. What is, are there county records or county regulations for Putnam that address the issue of slavery, movement, restrictions on Black people? There probably were. What is the history of allowing free Black men to vote in the county? So those are just a few of the things off the top of my head that you could look at. Were there any anti-slavery societies in Putnam County? Probably would have been developed in the 1830s when the movement really began to toughen up. And I suspect there were in some of the bigger places, but that's another avenue, and that's an important link between your local history and what was happening nationally.
Right.
We had in Dutchess County, there was at least one, there were probably several, but there's one that we know about, where in the 1830s, cities and towns all across the North began flooding Congress with petitions opposing slavery that they wanted to have read. And Congress passed a procedural rule or whatever that they were forbidden from being addressed on the floor of Congress. They got thousands and thousands of these things from the northern towns. There's probably some example of that somewhere in Putnam County as well.
Okay.
And you could also take a look at Civil War units. Were there any Blacks who signed up and were? I don't know your regiment numbers down there. I know them up here, and I had two grandfathers who fought out of Ulster County. I don't know your regimental history in Putnam, but that's another place. You could just do a small little article and say, hey, here's et cetera, et cetera. That'll get it started. And somebody's going to read that, or you're going to think about that and say, hey, now what about this? So
you had a lot of, or Dutchess County Historical, somebody had a lot of newspaper clippings about, ads for returning slaves, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, and that's interesting. I don't know what your archive's like. I don't know about any of your counties, but I'm impressed with Dutchess County Historical Society. They got tons of stuff. And what is this doing here? They got pictures of houses that they probably don't even know, but they get so many donations. Anyway, yeah, there is, and this is interesting. The 150th Regiment came mostly from Dutchess County. A few other folks came in. And there was stories in the Dutchess County History Society yearbook, which is where they published their articles. And there was talk of a number of freed Blacks. These were not soldiers, but these were freed Blacks from the war who came back to Poughkeepsie with the 150th Regiment. And I've had a couple of conversations with the current head of the unit, and he said, yeah, we've heard of those stories, but there's nothing in the official record of the regiment in Dutchess County. Now, it doesn't mean they weren't there. I mean, official records are one thing, and so, but that's an interesting reason. That's an interesting research question. And if you had regiments who came primarily out of Putnam, they might have a written regimental history, if you're lucky, and not all of them wrote an official one, and not all of the official ones survived. But that could be something else. That's another pathway in. And also take a look at the history of your African American churches in Putnam County. If you've got an AME Zion church in particular, that's going to be 99% a Black church. What is their history? How did they get started? The Zion, AME Zion, that's African Methodist, etc. How did they get started? When did they get started? And there might have been free Blacks in the county, obviously after 1827, who were joining those churches. They might have been involved in some kind of anti-slavery activity. Or like a number of the organizations in Dutchess, they might have formed free Black societies. There was a free Black community in Baxtertown over by Beacon. There was one in Hyde Park, just across from where the FDR Roosevelt is now. It's called Guineatown. There was one out in Freemanville near Dover Plains in Dutchess County, and it was called Freemanville. There's no trace of any Blacks living there now. There's a few graveyards at Guinea and down at Baxtertown. So, and what they did was, because they weren't comfortable among a lot of white people, and a lot of white people weren't comfortable with Black community, Blacks when they were free. So you might have in Putnam County some evidence or some history of free Black communities kind of living near or close together.
For you personally, what have been some of the most rewarding aspects working with the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery Project?
The people. And I thought about that question when I was looking at this. And the people are wonderful.
Mm.
The people that I work with, the people that I collaborate with, and they've all got one thing in common. They're excited about the history.
Mm.
You know, I don't, you know, I've got a couple of folks who are friends, but we're not intimate friends. And a lot of people I see once a month on a meeting or a phone call, and I meet a bunch of people when we do presentations or whatever. And we all love this history. And there are other historians in other fields or other people, but it's like I got too much to do because I keep having these ideas, or somebody said, let's do this. And it's like, it's hard to say no. And so I mean, I love the history, and I'm always finding, it's not so much for me right now doing a lot of new research, but I'm looking at stuff that we've done, and somebody will say something and I'll say, that's a new way to present this material. It's a new way to present this material. It's a new window on what has been hidden or not so well known. So first off, I would say it's the people I really enjoy working with. And, you know, people have got ideas, they've got energy, they've got programming, they got a different slant. So that's good. And this history is important, and that's a part of why I do it as well.
It's been a pleasure talking with you and learning all about your career and the different projects that you have been involved in. And I think I know just even from this talk how much this is going to help the Putnam History Museum, you know, begin to conduct this research, and then hopefully for our viewers as well.
Great.